They seem to be in that marmite. Many love them or hate them. But few who have been are indifferent. Why do people go there? There's nothing there. Maybe that's the point.
Can you speak up?
Can't hear.
Yeah. Is it the profound silence and the sheer vastness that gets to you deep down? This is sensory deprivation, sensory overload all at the same time. Is it the glaring, staring sun and the astonishingly sharp focused stars, one you cannot look at and you must hide from its relentless gaze, while with the others you cannot stop gazing back, always hoping that if you just lie still enough, for long enough, you will see that gently wheeling, inexorable progress. In his best-selling 1950 book, Popski wrote of the pervading hum of the constellations overhead as they pivoted round the low-lying pole. But George Murray, director of the Egyptian survey, writing him congratulations, said, "No, I won't have it. It was your men snoring." They had been neighbours near Cairo in the 1930s, and Murray was the RGS fellow who proposed Popski for his fellowship in 1937, seconded by his assistant, RGS fellow Pat Clayton. Is it the strange light at dawn and dusk? It was the long-range desert group founded by RGS fellow Rafe Bagnold in 1940, who discovered that a good camouflage colour for their trucks in that light was not sand, but pink. Since then, the Special Forces trucks of the SAS on desert operations have often been the same colour. This is why their heavily gunned Land Rovers are called Pink Panthers. Don't you just love it? Andy McNabb and Inspector Clouseau. Is it the smell, or the dryness, or the desiccation? Bagnold reported that crossing the huge Salima sand sheet on his 1932 expedition and looking for a very small, unmapped oasis and petrol dump, from 8 miles away, he could suddenly clearly smell the single camel of the policeman on guard and navigated directly to it on that northeast breeze. Is it the disorienting lack of feature or landmark? It's different from being at sea, passive, not active, peaceful, not restless. Sometimes the desert bed is so flat and smooth that it's possible to drive at high speed in any direction, with a weird sensation that you're not moving at all. Bagnold wrote of mesmerized expedition drivers falling asleep, again on the Salima sand sheet, while driving at 40 miles an hour. Popski wrote of crossing a dried-out lake near the Gilf Kabir in one of his brand new Jeeps on his way to the LRDG base at Kufra in 1942. We reached the lake bed. In the whole of its flat 70-odd square miles, there was one rock, buried in the sand and sticking out no more than 3 inches. I hit it at 50 miles an hour and destroyed both right-hand tyres. AA? Location? For a while, I lived at the top edge of the Western Desert, at Tobruk in Libya many years ago. I didn't get to see the real desert further south, as explored by Gerhard Rolfs in 1874, by Prince Hassanein Bey in 1923, then by Rafe Bagnold, Vladimir Penyakov, and many others. But I first read Popski's story there. Reading this book, in that desert, about that desert, and about the war that rolled across it, in and around Tobruk, changed me, it inspired me, and that's why I'm here today. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's RGS Collections event. My name is Suzi Paterson, and I am Secretary of Friends of Popski's Private Army. I'm also a member of the Royal Geographical Society. And of course, I used to be a fellow. But that's another story. Today, I should like to look back 1,000 miles and tell you a tale of exceptional men, of unusual times, and extraordinary places. We've been a bit spoilt by the Society in the last year with Professor Andrew Goody's lecture on the digitisation of the Society's film archive by the British Film Institute, including impressive footage of some of Bagnold expeditions, not to mention the launch of Andrew's book on Great Desert Explorers. Then in January we had Dr. Barbara Bond on MI9 and their silk escape maps. This was followed in February by Stephen Bagnold talking about his father. This talk complements Stephen's, and that's partly why it's sometimes a bit biased towards Popski rather than Bagnold, as Stephen covered his father's life in some detail, while Popski's life is less well known. I reiterate Stephen's comment about the impossibility of doing justice to the subjects in the time available. Some observations are necessarily a bit broad sweep. The material here comes from the archives of the Royal Geographical Society and the archives of Friends of Popski's Private Army, with some from the Society for Libyan Studies. There are 3 sections to the lecture: early, desert, and war. The short first section is just a bit of background context, followed by a look at desert exploration and then the war in the desert. We shall see how Popski and Bagnold's upbringing and education were relevant to their desert exploration experiences and how those experiences were relevant to special forces. I'm not the first to look at this theme of the relationship between desert exploration and special forces. Dr. Isla Forsyth wrote in the Geographical Journal on exactly this subject in 2016, but I think some new ground is being covered here. The billing for this lecture refers to the origins in the 1930s for the sake of advertising brevity. However, as I'm sure you're all well aware, the origins stretch back to the Great War, to the light car patrols, to Lawrence, to Delancey Forth's Frontier District Administration, and many others doing exploration in the Western Desert. There'll be nods to them, of course, but we only have an hour to play with. Relatedly, Popski's Libyan Arab Force Commando will only get a small mention. And that was it. This talk was originally going to be solely about Popski and his private army. But most of that story takes place in Italy, well away from desert exploration and the RGS. If you still want that, even after you've heard this one, then you must pester the Society until they agree to go round again. Now, briefly, let's get a few myths out of the way. 1, I am not Popski. I was not in Popski's private army. Yes, I have been asked. Need to change the face cream. Popski was not an eccentric Polish millionaire who privately funded PPA and paid his men double the British Army rate with bonuses for killing Germans. LRDG, SAS, and PPA were all irregular, wartime-only, special forces units of 8th Army. And I'm delighted to say that the daughter of one of only 2 men who served in all 3 units is with us here today. And her father, Sergeant Eric Brooks' North African MI9 silk escape map, is on display downstairs, along with one of his PPA shoulder flashes and Popski's own prismatic compass. 3, the official name of Popski's unit was No. 1 Demolition Squadron, PPA. Any variations of this in print are wrong. 4, General Wavell was receptive to Bagnold's proposals because during the Great War, as liaison officer to the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, he would have known of Lawrence's guerrilla successes in the Eastern Desert, as well as of the light car patrol successes against the Senussis in the Western Desert. The LRDG was Bagnold's idea, not Wavell's. 5. Second New Zealand Expeditionary Force troops were not selected for the LRDG because they were hardy boys, hardy farm boys, who could drive and maintain their own vehicles. This is back to front. They were offered the chance to volunteer because they had nothing to do since their arrival in the Middle East, because all their equipment was on a separate ship that was sunk in the Red Sea. After they joined the LRDG, it was discovered just how perfect they were for the job, because they were hardy farm boys, etc. 6. The LRDG was formed in the summer of 1940, initially as the Long Range Patrol, the SAS in the summer of 1941, and PPA in the summer of 1942. The rationale for the creation of each of these was independent of any of the others. Neither the SAS nor PPA were part of the LRDG, nor any other way round. And in the first 3 years of the North African campaign, there were no Americans in these units, despite Hollywood's best efforts. In my research, an interesting discovery about Vladimir Penyakov and Raif Alga Bagnold has been the parallels in their lives. They were born around the same time, Bagnold in 1896 in Devonport, and Popski in 1897 in Huy, Belgium. Poignantly, this talk is exactly between the anniversaries of their deaths. Popski on 15th of May 1951, 1 week ago, and Bagnold on the 28th of May 1990, in 1 week's time. Both of them came from families of chemical engineers. They both studied and qualified as mechanical and electrical engineers. Both went up to Cambridge. They were well educated, with inquiring, practical minds, and perfectly capable of solving technical problems from first principles. They came to Cairo at about the same time, Popski in 1924, Bagnold in 1926. It was the Roaring '20s, a time of social reaction, revision, and innovation after the Great War. Both became mountaineers, desert explorers, made their own sun compasses, founded their own special forces units, were decorated by the British and the Belgians, then became writers. Did their background lead them inexorably in the same direction, to the same places? I don't think so. We cannot make too much of it, but it's interesting. They grew up in comfortable middle-class surroundings, Devonport for Bagnold and Brussels for Popski. Bagnold's maternal grandfather owned a firm making chemical fertilizers, while Popski's father had invented and patented a new way of making aluminium. He built a chemical plant in Salziet in northern Belgium for access to Antwerp's refineries, and Vladdy worked there in the labs. Incidentally, I think Daniel Radcliffe is a dead ringer for Bagnold, as David Suchet is for Popski. So that's the casting for the film sorted. Potter and Poirot. Their Great War experiences were very different, though. Popski had gone from private tutors to studying engineering at the Free University in Brussels at the age of 15. Then up to Cambridge in 1915 to study mathematics at St. John's to avoid the draft when Belgium was invaded, and became a pacifist. After 4 terms, though, he dropped out and joined the French army as a gunner. But the details of his training, deployment, and discharge to hospital are not known, and neither is his fundamental change of heart. Some have doubted that he was ever in the French army, but here's a photo of him in uniform on leave. Bagnold, meanwhile, had a very straight progression through Malvern College and Military Prep School to the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich for military engineers, then straight into the Corps of Royal Engineers and out to the Western Front in 1915 as a second lieutenant. During the war, He attained the rank of captain, was awarded a mention in dispatches, and was made a Chevalier of the Belgian Order of Leopold. After the armistice, he was able to take a break from the army and go up to Gonville and Keys, Cambridge, for a short 2-year post-war MA in engineering, frustrated though by its theoretical rather than practical focus. Then he returned to service and transferred to the Royal Corps of Signals, and in 1926 was posted to Egypt. After leaving the French army, Popski qualified as an engineer in Grenoble, then spent a miserable year looking for work until in 1924 a relative recommended him to a friend for a job in an Egyptian sugar factory. He moved to Houamdia and bought a large, airy, newly built house on the western bank of the Nile. In Sand, Wind and War, Bagnold recalled an early memory of sitting on his potty in Jamaica. In conversation with Popski's daughter Anne a few years ago, she told me a similar tale, and of being forbidden to get off her potty on the veranda at Houamdia, so she shuffled along, pulling it with her so she could see what the grown-ups were doing round the corner. Just across from that house is the lush suburb of Mardi, on the eastern bank, with its wide avenues, imported trees, and grand houses. This is where George Desert Murray lived, entertaining Popski and Freya Stark. Murray's colleague, Pat Clayton, lived only a few streets away, and Albert Saysens, a sugar manufacturer whose daughter Popski married. The LRDG were based in a house there during the war. Samir Rafat's and Artemis Cooper's books give a very entertaining view of life in Mardi and wartime Cairo. As you can see for yourselves, Popski got his pilot's license in 1937, showing that he had completed 3 hours of solo flying. Does this mean, though, that he could only fly from east to west? Relatedly, both Guy Prendergast and Count Laszlo Almasi were also pilots. In this desert section, let's start with the vehicles. Everything revolves around the vehicles. Horses are okay, but have large water needs, limited range, and will just stop when they've had enough. Camels are better, as they can go 15 days without water, and indeed will keep going until they drop dead. But light cars could go much further and with bigger loads. This radically changed the exploration game. The Ford Model T started production in 1908. It was very cheap and reliable, designed to work well on rough American country back roads, with a higher ground clearance than most other cars at that time. Its 2.9-litre inline four-cylinder engine had petrol consumption on roads of about 14 to 25 imperial gallons per mile, and a much wider torque range than modern engines, meaning that it had very good pulling power at lower revs. It was also very simple to maintain, with standardized interchangeable parts, and spares were plentiful. Ford factories were eventually capable of assembling each car in 93 minutes flat. Apart from the low price in 1926 of about $360, about £72 at that time, perhaps what really set the Model T apart from other cars for desert exploration was Henry Ford's innovative use of vanadium steel alloy for the chassis and the front axle. Vanadium steel is much cheaper to manufacture. It's stronger and lighter than ordinary steel and has astonishing torsional strength, twisting. This gem came from Russell McGurk's excellent book on the light car patrols. You may have seen that Bagnold footage of a Model T impressively bending and flexing as it drives down a very rough hill track, with a single transverse suspension front and back also absorbing the strain. Bagnold, in Libyan sands, said that on one difficult occasion he could swear that the axles were at right angles to each other. The Model A was introduced at the end of 1927, so was available for the 1929 expedition, priced at $385, about £77, for the cheapest model. It had a 3.3-litre engine, and for the first time, Fords were fitted with what we now know as the standard driver controls layout. One thing to note is that Bagnold expedition cars were newly bought each time, then sold off when they got back to Cairo, offsetting the costs. Only one owner, low mileage, only driven on soft sand, honest. In the desert, weight and often speed is critical for crossing sand, so a lighter chassis was a great start. Bagnold and his colleagues then reduced weight and aided cooling by discarding all unnecessary parts like the bonnet, doors, mudguards and roof. All of this enabling a bigger load of fuel and water, and therefore considerably extending their range. They removed also the standard pickup body behind the cab and replaced it with a simple, sturdy wooden frame. The other main modification was the addition of a condenser. Originally devised by Captain Leicester Ouston of the Light Car Patrols in 1916 for their Model Ts in that same terrain, this was a system for conserving energy coolant water with almost 100% efficiency. Ouston's was an open system, but Bagnold's was closed, needing no intervention at all. It used basic physics. The radiator cap was modified so that it didn't let steam out through an escape valve, but through a rubber tube, which led to a similarly sealed can part filled with cold water. As the engine inevitably boiled off in the searing desert heat, the expanding steam flowed into the collecting can, cooled down, and condensed back into water. As the 3-gallon radiator lost more and more water to the 4-gallon flimsy, that too would boil. A vacuum would build up in the radiator and eventually suck the water back in, cooling itself down with no loss at all. This very neat solution could not have failed to appeal to engineer Bagnold. He knew Colonel Delancey Forth, CEO of the Frontier Districts Administration during the Great War, so maybe he learned from him firsthand about the operation of the light car patrols. Popski bought himself a Model A with a pickup body and a canvas tilt in about 1930, but seems otherwise not to have modified it at all. He called it the piss pot. We're very short of information and photos of Popski's mainly and unusually single-handed desert exploration, but it would appear that this was mostly confined to the desert east of Cairo to the Red Sea, and some camel-based excursions westward from Nag Hammadi, northwest of Luxor. The only multi-vehicle expedition that we know of was in 1933 to Siwa via Mersa Matruh with 11 other friends in Ford Model A's. Unfortunately, Popski's travels are only described in 2 short chapters, one in his own book and one in a rare book by his Italian friend Count Paolo Caccia Dominioni, whom he curiously never mentions. He acknowledges hearing about Bagnold's exploits in the 30s and being inspired by them, but it's not clear if they ever met before the war. The link between all of them, from the light car patrols to the LRDG, is the mapping work of Dr. John Ball, George Murray, and Patrick Clayton of the Survey Department of Egypt. What the Model A's optionally had was balloon tyres. These started to appear in the mid-1920s as a result of improvements in manufacturing techniques. They became very popular as they not only doubled the wear distance, but because they used lower pressures with wider tread, provided a more comfortable ride. the beneficial effect of lower load per square inch on sand was not lost on motorised desert explorers. To this day, it's still possible in parts of the Western Desert to see or even feel the tracks made by those vehicles all those years ago. When the vehicles inevitably got stuck in soft dune patches, many methods were used to unstick them, the simplest being to unload everything and push. Bagnold and Popski used a variety of materials to help: chicken wire, rope, sand ladders, devised by Pat Clayton for his surveying trips, canvas matting, steel trench dugout roofing channels from the Palestinian campaign of World War I, found by Lieutenant Barder, Royal Engineers, in a Cairo junk shop. Additionally, Bagnold and his colleagues, after much experimentation on the problem of differing sand qualities, settled on basically two levels of tyre pressure, low and soft for the dunes and quite hard for traversing the Syria of the desert bed. In the end, they also got very good at recognising soft sand on the fly, and soft sand patches on the fly, and avoiding them. Where am I? This must be one of the oldest, most fundamental and frequent questions that humans have ever asked. I often ask this. It's usually not an absolute question, but a relative one. Where am I in relation to home, to water, or food, or danger? It's rarely a static philosophical question. It's about movement in a particular direction and how to get there, about navigation. Understanding the relationship between the sun, moon, and stars to where you are and where you're going has been grasped by many different peoples in many different places over millennia, and thought about and explained, feared and revered in many ways. But everyone in the Northern Hemisphere has been able to see for themselves that the pole star is always in the same place. It's perhaps curious then that it took so long for anyone to make that mental leap from believing that the heavens rotated round the pole star to realizing that this was an illusion created by standing on a rotating planet instead. Did we really need Galileo for this? Only our thinking needed to rotate. There's never been a religious strong point. In practical terms, though, it doesn't matter because the resulting navigational certainty is still the same. The basic problem in the Western Desert was the almost complete lack of accurate maps, despite the occupying Italians convincing their high command, that it was all well documented, including the depths of the Calancho Sound Sea. I don't think so. Bagnold did have 1 to 500,000 Egyptian map sheets, largely blank, but characteristically folded in half and kept conveniently flat in a thin custom wooden case, rather than rolled up as usual and a nightmare to manage in a high wind. The Italians were not short of their own desert expeditions, though, themselves, as this recently discovered list shows, of colonial science in the Fezzan. Time for Andrew Goody to update his wheels across the desert, I think. Clearly, 1932 to 1937 was a busy time for all. If you want to know more about the who, when, and where of Libyan desert expeditions, then a good place to start is Andras Zbore's website, FJ Expeditions, which lists them all since 1873, except these Italian ones, as they've only just recently surfaced via the Society for Libyan Studies, and except another one that was pointed out to me just a few days ago in the RGS archives from Cairo to Siwa and Mersa in 1933 by employees of the Cable and Wireless Telegraph Company. Andrus' website has amazing collection of desert exploration books as well. So everything you ever wanted to know. Many instruments have been designed to measure and mimic and predict this apparent movement of the heavens, from Stonehenge to the Antikythera mechanism of 200 BCE to modern computers. One of these was the astrolabe, first mentioned in English literature in 1391 in a technical manual written by Chaucer. The armillary sphere, or spherical astrolabe, was the navigation instrument that Popski adopted as the symbol of his travels and the name of his Nile canoe. The original title of his famous book was The Oryx and the Astrolabe. Here's an astrolabe on the roof of the town hall at Lokeren. This is a small market town in northern Belgium, only a few miles south of Father Dmitry Penyakov's chemical factory at Salzit. That astrolabe is almost certainly the origin of Popski's Ex Libris card, designed in 1930s for his extensive Cairo library by his mountaineering friend Count Paolo Caccia Dominioni, and then adopted as the cap badge for Popski's private army. In practical terms, and primarily for nautical navigation, the sextant, for measuring the angle of the sun and stars above the horizon, combined with highly reliable portable timepieces for keeping track of the exact time at Greenwich, or Paris if you were French, and detailed, accurate printed tables allowed travellers to determine exactly where they were in terms of latitude and longitude. Sextants were eventually replaced by the more sophisticated surveyors' theodolites, driven partly by the needs of 19th century American railroad engineers. The Egyptian Survey Department used theodolites, as did Bagnold and Popski for their desert trips. Popski paid so much for his particularly fancy piece that he had to cancel a mountaineering holiday. Chronometers, meanwhile, were made almost redundant by wireless signals that regularly broadcast an accurate GMT time signal. Here's Bagnold's theodolite and radio car, along with British Army Astrofix instructions. One of the many advantages of multi-car exploration was the ability to spread equipment around different vehicles. Another instrument, of course, was the magnetic compass, devised from lodestones that magically knew where the pole star was, even during a cloudy day. But these were difficult to use because the metal in the cars unpredictably threw the needle off course. The solution was to use a sun compass, compensating every 15 minutes or so for the sun's progress above. Various sun compass designs seem to have been made during the Great War. It wasn't that Bagnold invented the sun compass, another myth. What this clever engineer did was to devise one that could be used on the fly when it was just not practical to stop and make notes and recalibrate it in that unforgiving terrain. In the display downstairs, we have a Bagnold sun compass, one of 3 accurately recreated a few years ago from the LRDG original in the Imperial War Museum. Popski, too, built his own sun compass, but it had none of the agility of Bagnold's design. He studied navigation, perhaps with personal tuition from Murray and Clayton, and became adept at using the combination of theodolite, time signals, and astrofix tables that lets you figure out where you are on the planet. The accurate calculation of astronomical tables, of course, takes us right back to the dawn of computing, to Charles Babbage, to Ada Lovelace and George Boole. On Bagnold's expeditions, these readings and calculations were always done by two men, working closely together. But Popski did it all on his own, a measure perhaps of his character. At best, impressive independence, but at worst, foolhardy pig-headedness. Sadly, we have little detail at all of what he did nor how. He survived, though, so he must have got something right. An enormous amount of supplies had to be carried, with many trade-offs against weight, space, spares, range, sustenance, contingency, with the list refined over many years of tough practical experience. The rations, type and quantity per man per day, were carefully and systematically worked out by Captain Craig MC, Royal Engineers. He had the gift of being able to, at any moment, even in the dark, reach down and put his hand on just the tin he wanted, in the correct case, in the right car. As the Navy discovered the hard way many years before, men on rations with no fresh vegetables soon get scurvy. To solve this problem, Bagnold and his colleagues used a recipe devised by an army doctor. It was their evening cocktail, consisting of equal parts rum, whiskey, and lime juice, with Worcester sauce and a sprinkling of pepper. Where am I? These were not military expeditions, but the army nonetheless loaned them weapons such as rifles, Mills bombs, and automatic pistols, never used apparently. The size of the custom-built wooden pickup body frames on the cars was not arbitrary. At that time, and well into World War II, petrol was supplied by the Shell Oil Company in 4-gallon cans called flimsies. And they were flimsy too, very easily splitting and leaking. They were supplied in 2-can wooden boxes, which could be used as tables and seats or firewood when the cans were empty. Early in the expeditions, it was discovered that the empty cans could make very efficient stoves when the top was cut off and a hole made in the side. The internal length and width of the body frames were exact multiples of those standard wooden boxes and designed to hold 20 of them, so they wouldn't rattle around and break. Water was stored in new flimsies, again supplied by Shell, and food and other supplies were also stored in boxes the same size. This is early modular containerization and came from RGS fellow Guy Prendergast's practical thinking. Bagnold tells us that in their expedition calculations, they reckoned on 12 miles per gallon in the Model A's. So, with a maximum possible load of 28-gallon boxes of petrol, but nothing else, each car had a theoretical range of nearly 2,000 miles. That would get you nearly a third of the way from Cairo to Cape Town if you took a wrong turn at Uweinat. In practice, multiple fuel dumps were used, was set up in advance, much needed for one expedition of 6,000 miles. The far superior jerry can wasn't invented until 1936-37, and then used extensively by both sides during the war. Now, perhaps I can pull all these threads together, looking more closely at Special Forces. What of the LRDG's name and its badge? Starting a completely new unit? Well, you've got to have a name and a badge and shoulder flashes and a uniform, with little or no history or tradition to call upon. We can easily see the progression from light car patrols to long-range patrol to the long-range desert group, regarded by many as the finest Special Forces unit ever formed. PPA's unit name never included the words long range, despite the howler that Sean Hackett himself made in the foreword to one edition of Popski's book. Brigadier Ord Wingate's long-range penetration groups only appeared in the Far East in 1943, although he had also made an expedition into the Great Sand Sea from the south in 1933, bumping into Pat Clayton on the way. And you thought the Western Desert was devoid of people? Piccadilly Circus. Some have curiously confused Popski and Wingate, alleging that PPA operated in the Sudan. A judge in Chambers once noted to me that Popski and Wingate were both rather strange. I said that while Popski was perhaps mildly eccentric, Wingate was arguably insane. It would seem that the light car patrols didn't have their own insignia, while the LRDG adopted the image of a scorpion, known for looking fairly benign, cute even, but carrying a sting whose effect was quite disproportionate to its size. They weren't the first to use this little insect, though. The LRDG's Teddy Mitford claimed that he drew inspiration for the LRDG Scorpion badge from an Italian company Auto Sahariana insignia that he saw during his 1938 trip to Kufra Oasis. The Auto Sahariana were certainly using a Scorpion for at least a whole year before the LRDG were formed. On the right there is the Scorpion insignia for Rommel's special unit Sonderkommando Dora. But were these two-axis units special forces? Not really, I think. The Auto Sahariana were more like the light car patrol, not born out of desert exploration, doing colonial policing against the uppity Senussi, from Jarlo through the Fezzan to Kufra. In January 1941, though, they destroyed an LRDG patrol in the Battle of Jebel Sharif, northwest of Kufra, capturing Pat Clayton, and by 1942, they were equipped with the fearsome-looking AS-42. The LRDG got their own back later when they captured the Italian post at Hon, with LRDG intelligence officer Bill Kennedy Shaw liberating the post's commander's Sahariana photo album, now on show on display downstairs. Isn't that rock magnificent? I've no idea where it is, but it looks like a champagne cork to me. What of Sonderkommando Dora? What are we to make of this unit then? This was the nearest equivalent that the Germans had to the LRDG. It was purely a survey unit of cartographers, geographers, and geologists, although supported by some armoured cars, and they also had aircraft and gliders at their disposal. This Sonderkommando had no offensive intent, but they acquitted themselves fairly well in the shootout at Wadi Zemzem in an accidental battle with a joint PPA and LRDG patrol. No talk of desert and war would be complete without a mention of Hungarian Count Laszlo Almasi, FRGS, the inspiration for the English patient. He didn't operate as a member of any Deutsches Afrika Korps Special Forces as such, but he was employed for Operation Salam to guide the small unit taking 2 German spies past the Gulf Kabir to get them to Cairo. The route for this was almost exactly the reverse of an LRDG route from the Nile at Asyut into the Western Desert, which he knew well from his own pre-war desert exploration. Unfortunately for the spies, a very sharp young woman, an Enigma analyst at Bletchley Park, picked up on their coded signals and direction of transmission, grasping immediately what they signified. The two luckless chaps were monitored almost from the moment they arrived and then arrested by Major Sansom, head of Cairo Field Security Service. Downstairs, we are very lucky to have on display two of Al-Massi's jerry cans from Operation Salam. They were recovered from his fuel dump near the Gulf Kabir by Pat Clayton's son Peter, who made several post-war trips to follow in his father's footsteps. You may also be interested to know that a faithful reproduction of Al-Massi's pre-war Ford A has been built and tested in the Tunisian desert, but time constraints mean I cannot show you the beautiful film of it in action. Then, of course, there's the SAS. They only get a small mention, not because they don't deserve more, but because their origin is not in desert exploration. The rationale for L Detachment SAS came from David Stirling's dissatisfaction with the limitations of commando operations. However, the style of their devastatingly effective deployment developed rapidly once they teamed up with the LRDG for navigation and made use of the newly invented Bantams, better known as Jeeps, for attack. So let's think about Special Forces vehicles for a bit. In the Great War, light cars, except on the Egyptian-Libyan border, were merely for transport. Indeed, Henry Ford was adamantly against the use of his cars in war and tried to prevent it. The military world invented tanks and started applying armour to other vehicles as the shortcomings of cavalry and infantry against machine guns became obvious. Hard-skinned vehicles were offensive, while soft-skinned vehicles were supportive. The thing about tanks and armoured cars is that everything's on the inside. Fuel, weapons, ammunition, radio, food, drink, all protected and hidden, and cramped and uncomfortable, and heavy with limited speed and movement, and limited vision. The British High Command had limited vision too. The Germans took far more notice of Captain Basil Littlehart's interwar years of analysis of the use of fast armour than we did, and paid dearly for it. The vehicles of the LRDG, SAS, and PPA, however, had everything on the outside, unprotected, easy to access, with no armour. Fuel on the bonnet, machine guns fore and aft, ammo supplies in the open back, sometimes even artillery. This is quite radical if you think about it, taking fast, lightweight, low-profile, soft-skinned support vehicles and making them offensive. In the case of SAS and PPA Jeeps, making them very offensive indeed. PPA Italian campaign Jeeps were each mounted with .50 and .30 Browning belt-fed machine guns, giving a 6-Jeep patrol the same firepower as an infantry battalion, with vastly more manoeuvrability. Those Chevys and Jeeps were perhaps like inside-out tanks, and they fundamentally changed a significant part of the Desert War. What's in a name? Shakespeare asked us. In his February lecture, Stephen Bagnold delightfully revealed that his father's nickname on expeditions was Bang on Baggers. Captures the man in a hurry in an instant. But where did Popski's nickname come from? After the Barchi raid in September 1942 and back at Siwa, Popski overheard Guy Prendergast referring to him as Popski over the phone, who then apologised. Nobody can understand Penyakov over the phone. He remembered that my namesake was the comical, hairy little Bolshe in, was it the Daily Mirror? comic strip. This explanation has been accepted ever since, but it's not true. The comical hairy little Bolshe did indeed appear in a kind of sub-cartoon to the main and famous cartoon called Pipsqueak and Wilfred. These strange characters had been running for so long in the Daily Mirror and were so well known to British readers that the standard group of 3 Great War medals were named after them. The other chap was a very scruffy Russian Bolshevik with a habit of carrying spherical bombs marked bomb, with lit fuses and then blowing himself up. This was the LRDG's affectionate view of Popski as a mad Russian bomber after his exploits in the Jebel Akhdar with his Libyan Arab Force commando. Here is Bill Kennedy Shaw's post-war letter to Popski saying, you can see at the bottom, "I've always claimed, whether true or not, I don't know, to have been the first to call you Popski." And it was Lieutenant Colonel Shan Hackett who came up with the unit's cover name of Popski's Private Army as a sly joke against Middle East Forces HQ. But, as you can see here, in a reprint of the cartoon, the mad Russian wasn't called Popski at all. He was called Professor Vitskovsky. It was his equally mad and scruffy dog that was called Popski. And that wasn't Popski's only nickname. During the Italian campaign, he was sometimes referred to by his men as Curly, but never to his face, of course. But back to the Jebel Akhdar. In 1994, an archaeologist and member of the Society for Libyan Studies called Dorothy Thorne wrote to PPA's Corporal Ben Owen about her research trips to Cyrenaica and how she kept coming across mentions of a mysterious Englishman who spied on the enemy behind the lines for months and then disappeared, never to be seen again. This chap's name, according to Dr. Fadel, controller of Cyrenaican antiquities, was Ben Ikuf. Now, Kuf means cave in Arabic, confusing everyone as the origin of the name. However, when Dorothy started digging deeper, she remembered that the Libyans couldn't pronounce the letter P, so used B instead. You can see where this is going. This was how the Cyrenaicans were pronouncing Penyakov, but including a typically Libyan pun about the spy who lived among them in caves. Relatedly, a few years ago, I was approached by a chap at a Society of Libyan Studies meeting who identified himself as a Libyan and then revealed that his grandmother had been one of the young Abidi tribe women who had brought food to Popski's cave. And where was all this fun and games going on? Here's Popski's map of his North African campaign, showing the route that the LRDG took to the Jebel Akhdar for the raid on Bachi airfield in Operation Caravan. That's the dotted line up to there. And PPA's route from Cairo to Tazur via Kufra and Zela. Gilf Kabir, Salima Sandsheet, Kufra here, Zela, Wadi Zemzem, Tazur. Most of the LRDG, SAS and PPA action took place in the centre section of that map. The map was drawn by H.A. Bennett, FRGS, who may be here with us this evening. It shows, as I say, the Salima Sandsheet, Gilf Kabir, Kufra, the Barith line. Operation Caravan was one of 4 raids conducted at the same time along with the infamous Combined Forces raid on Tobruk, Operation Agreement, the Operation Bigamy raid, SAS raid on Benghazi, and the Sudan Defence Force raid on Jalo, called Operation Nicety. All except the Bachi raid failed due to sloppy security in Cairo. The LRDG knew how to keep their mouths shut. Although later it was discovered that Italians knew about Bachi too, but only at the last minute, and with no useful detail. In the display downstairs is a first edition copy of Popski's book from the Fopper archives, signed by Italian Lieutenant Gazzano Prioroggia, the officer who wrote the official report about the Bachi raid, as reproduced in the book. The LRDG's main job, though, was reconnaissance, surveying and intelligence gathering, and to get to where they could observe Rommel's troops and tanks moving from Tripoli to the front line, they had to cross the Great Sand Sea. To do this, they used every lesson learned from their pre-war desert expeditions. They used the same equipment, the same thinking about how the trucks were modified and organised and fuelled, such that weapons and equipment could be found immediately to hand. The flimsies were once again recycled as stoves, but now used petrol-soaked sand and became known as Benghazi burners. The men were fed using a similarly generous ration scale that became the envy of regular units. And they were given special permission not to shave, marking the men out immediately as special forces. They used Bagnold sun compasses, theodolites, time signal radios, steel sand channels and canvas sand mats, and exactly the same techniques for unsticking the trucks. They even managed to get standard number 11 wireless sets to work over hundreds of miles when their design range maximum was only 20 miles. Here we see clearly how the supplies fitted exactly into the trucks, just as they were on the Model A Fords, and where the condensers were fitted. Little, if anything, was new to Bagnold, Prendergast, Clayton, Kennedy Shaw, and Vladimir Penyakov, all fellows of the Royal Geographical Society. They had worked it all out 10 years before. But they proved, in battle, the worth of their ingenuity grounded in hard experience, practical engineering and expedition logistics, and in their unconventional, flexible thinking, the very core of how special forces operate. The RAF took a similarly daring approach in 1982. In a way, the joint LRDG Free French attack on Merzouk in 1941, relying on fuel dumps to travel an enormous distance and attack when least expected an enemy that they thought were invulnerable, is the same as 607 Squadron's epic flight in Operation Black Buck to crater the runway at Stanley in the Falklands. The psychological impact on the enemy's thinking in each case far outweighed the cost of those operations. After the battles of El Alamein, the war rapidly shifted west, and the LRDG and PPA moved from their base at Kufra to a new one at Zella Oasis. This is the only known photograph of PPA's standard SAS jeeps in the Western Desert. Popski's photograph album of his war disappeared sometime after 1954 and has not been seen since. PPA and the LRDG arrived in Zella at the end of 1942, just in time to have a slap-up Christmas New Year meal. Looking at these famous signatures, you could almost imagine yourself present and mingling with these outstanding but modest men. So, I don't know if you can see, we've got PPA's Bob Yunny at the top, Nick Wilder, Bill Kennedy Shaw, Doc Lawson, I think this is Shorty Barrett, Jake Easonsmith, Tim Haywood, Oliver Poole, Nick Hunter. Not sure about the others. That's wonderful. That's from the from the Fopper archives. Rommel was on the run, and the North African campaign would be all over within a few months, leaving the desert masters of the LRDG, SAS, and PPA almost at a loss about what to do with their hard-won expertise. So what happened next? Well, that's another story. Popski and Bagnold have entertained and inspired many for years with their lives and their tales of desert and war. They made a significant contribution to the development of special forces, as did many others, of course. Popski's book was even designated as required reading by certain army units. Bagnold single-handedly clarified and quantified the dynamic nature of sand dunes on Earth and on Mars too, rightly being also made a Fellow of the Royal Society. Not a bad legacy for these two Fellows of the Royal Geographical Society for a bit of swanning around in the desert, free as the oryx they met along the way. Thank you.
Do we have any questions for Suzi? Any questions?
Gosh.
Oh. Gentleman there.
Is there any kind of rumors what happened about these photo albums and the spirit?
None whatsoever. I think there was a burglary at Pamela's house. That's one theory. Another is that the last mention we have of it is in John Woolett's biography in 1954. And I spoke to his widow a few years ago, and she said that she had a vague recollection of somebody coming to pick up all the papers, all of Woolett's papers. Who, when, where they went, don't know. I sincerely hope it's somewhere in somebody's private collection, and that eventually it will resurface. Yes.
Just a small point of history about the infamous flimsies. My father commanded 543 Company Royal Army Service Corps in this period, the early part of the period in the Western Desert. And they did the long walk from Cairo straight through to Tobruk. And I remember them telling me as a child how they used to lose 25% of what they were carrying in the flimsies in that one war.
Yes.
He said it was the poor and the most. Jerry cans didn't come in until eventually we captured all the German ones, and then they eventually got around to making them British side. But at that time it was all flimsies. And I know what they're like. Much later I got Shell used to sell kerosene in Yemen in flimsies. So I know how they really put them on the tower.
Yes.
At the back.
Oh, at the back.
What happened to the last jeeps from Italy? Is there any accounts of them being put into military
were they being scrapped?
My understanding is they were, all military vehicles were just assembled in a large depot somewhere. I have a note in the archives where Benny Owen thought that the PPA flamethrower Jeep, possibly the only flamethrower Jeep in World War II, had gone to the Imperial War Museum. But IWM deny all knowledge of it. Popski, in some correspondence that I have, talks about the army saying to him, your Jeep is, we don't know about it, it's not one of ours, take it away. And he drove it back to Brussels. But what happened to it after that, I really don't know. As far as I know, the only known true PPA Italian campaign Jeep is at the bottom of Taranto Harbour. It should still be there.
Well, if we don't have any more questions, can you join me in thanking Suzi again, and then we'll go and have some tea.
And for Eugene as well. Thank you, Susan. Thank you very much. Thank you. I believe someone's got a Benghazi burner going out there.